Remember when wet races were the most exciting and eagerly anticipated thing in Formula 1? Yet today, while there's still that frisson of excitement, usually that's overwhelmed by the fear that there won't be much racing at all. What's more, when the racing does get going, usually drivers are straight onto intermediate rubber and there's none of the strategic divergence and risk-taking you'd hope for in wet races. That means a more straightforward race than the traditional dramatic rain-hit Grand Prix of ages past. So why is this happening? Well, Mercedes driver and GPDA director George Russell says it's partly down to a pointless aspect of F1 that was once central to racing in the wet, and that's one of several problems F1 needs to solve. And it's important to tackle this, given wet weather has impacted all of the last 6 race weekends. Let's use the recent Belgian Grand Prix sprint race as an example of the problem Russell is talking about. The race got started with 4 formation laps behind the safety car. In those circumstances, full wet tyres must be used until the safety car pulls in. When the safety car headed into the pits at the start of what had effectively become an 11-lap race, 10 cars, 1 from each team, poured in to change to intermediates. At the end of the next lap, the other half of the field did the same. Often the FIA is criticised with this cited as evidence of the safety car being left out for too long, but the characteristics of the tyres play a big part, and generally, when a track is in condition to race on it, it is ready for intermediates. That's why Russell branded the Pirelli wets pretty pointless. He described the wets as probably 6-7 seconds a lap slower than the intermediates, and argued that the wets are only required if the standing water is so bad that you risk aquaplaning. He called for the wet tyres to be substantially improved. Russell's not the only one to complain. For years, drivers have criticised the wets, which is sometimes referred to as the safety car tyre after Sebastian Vettel coined the term in his Ferrari days. Charles Leclerc echoed Russell's position, describing the wets as really good for avoiding aquaplaning, but that the visibility is so bad in such conditions that inevitably that running will be under the safety car. This means that as soon as the track is even close to ready for intermediates, it's essential to make the switch, given the lap time difference. We'll come back to the visibility problems later because that's a separate issue, but what Russell and Leclerc said about the wets is representative of the opinions of the drivers. So what does Pirelli say? Well, its F1 boss Mario Isola said that the Belgian Grand Prix weekend showed Pirelli does need to improve the performance of its wets. These tyres were largely developed at tracks such as Fiorano and Paul Ricard, where it's possible to soak the circuit artificially. But high-speed Spa is a more stern test, so tyres that in testing had lapped 15 or 16% off the dry pace were more like 20% off in the wet at Spa. Given the intermediate crossover point was around 110 to 112% of dry pace, that's too big a gap. And as the intermediates are good enough to deal with a certain amount of standing water, for example at Spa if the rivers running across the track aren't too wide, that means that it's rare for the wet tyres to be used for green flag running. But a faster wet would make the crossover point to intermediate tyres less clear cut and prevent everyone having to make the switch at the same time. Perhaps the most obvious solution is that Pirelli makes its wet tyres better. Isola has already admitted that this is an objective, and it's hoped that it will be possible to make gains for next year. But the wet tyre has been a problem for a long time, and the 2023 specification is itself an improvement from last year. At the Monaco Grand Prix, a wet tyre requiring no tyre blankets was introduced, and it works fine in terms of warm-up, it just lacks grip. Pirelli faces many limitations when it comes to testing tyres. It's dependent on the teams supplying cars, and wet conditions are hard to come by. Fortunately, it did get the chance to rack up around 1,500 kilometres of running at Spa after the Belgian Grand Prix in the wet with McLaren and Aston Martin. But wet weather is rarely as dependable as it is at Spa, and even when it does rain, the intensity is inconsistent and doesn't provide the steady-state wet conditions Pirelli would prefer. So what else could be done? Well, another proposal is the creation of what has been dubbed a super intermediate tyre that would replace both the wet and intermediate tyre. This would effectively mean creating a single wet specification tyre for F1 that could work across a broad range of conditions. This is being discussed as a possibility for the future and would require a new tread pattern to be developed capable of dealing with significant standing water with a tyre that would still provide good grip in intermediate conditions. And as Pirelli, which tends to be pulled in different directions by F1, says, it's down to F1 to decide if that's a direction it wants to take. Pirelli does this in other championships that have a single specification of wet tyre, and there's an appeal to a tyre that can be run in all wet conditions until changing to slicks. The question is whether such a product can be developed. Pirelli says yes, and already has ideas for the kind of tread pattern required because this is an idea it has worked on in the past. However, even if the FIA and F1 requested this right now, the tyres wouldn't be ready for the start of next season. That's because the production of the tyres for the early season races starts in December, so if the super intermediates are the solution, they wouldn't be ready until during the 2024 season at the earliest. So there are two solutions: either improve the wet performance so that it's a relevant race tyre in conditions where the visibility would allow green flag running, or pursue the super intermediate tyre. But it's important to note that it's not just about tyres. The cars have become more prone to aquaplaning over the years as well, that coming from the floor of the car aquaplaning rather than the tyres, while the problem of visibility is one that makes it impossible to run in the worst of conditions. The laws of physics mean that visibility is always a problem in wet conditions. Wet tyres are designed to cut through and clear the water, so throw huge amounts of spray into the air, as do the floors of the cars. The water has to go somewhere, and when you're travelling at 180 miles an hour plus, it creates an impenetrable grey murk. But visibility does appear to have become a bigger problem in recent times, and for all the critics rushing to brand drivers cowards for not racing in such conditions, at times it genuinely is impossible. As Daniel Ricciardo put it, you can't see in anything above 4th gear, and visibility is worse than ever. This is where the FIA's ambitious Spray Guards project comes into it. Launched last year, partly as a result of the desire to avoid a repeat of the farcical 2021 Belgian Grand Prix that never was, the hope is this will solve the problem of F1 cars not being able to race in extreme wet conditions. The first version of what's also called the Wet Weather Package, or WWP because F1 loves an acronym, was trialled at Silverstone in a straight line test after the British Grand Prix. This is designed to be bolted onto cars before running in the wettest of conditions to contain the spray. The aim of the project is to reduce the spray by around 50%. This was a design created by the FIA and engineered by Mercedes and fitted to the car Mick Schumacher was testing, but the FIA's Nicholas Tombazis admitted it made no tangible difference to the visibility. However, this was just a first trial, and the research and development programme goes on. The hope is that a new version can be trialled on track later this year. The main challenge is that it's not only the wheels that produce spray, but also the diffuser, and it's proving tricky to work out the exact split. The Spray Guards project is proving tougher than expected, but it's an ambitious and laudable ambition, one that is being pursued in the right way with in-depth research by the FIA. The timeline for introduction is fluid, and it will only happen once a suitable design can be found. Our very own Gary Anderson, former F1 technical director, has drawn up his idea for version 2 of the Spray Guards, but we'll have to wait a few months to see whether the FIA goes in this direction or opts for something that encloses even more of the wheels. One thing is for sure though, covering the diffuser isn't an option for aero reasons, so it's not going to cover the entire back of the car. The question is whether it's actually possible to come up with a bolt-on body kit that doesn't disrupt the cars too badly and that achieves the objectives. It might well prove to be too ambitious. But if the project is successful, it will be the solution to F1's biggest wet weather problem, visibility. Then it will be up to Pirelli to produce suitable tyres to bring back the good old days of classic wet weather Grand Prix.